It's one thing to actually understand the foundational elements of what an accounting system is and what information management is and what an ERP system is and why they matter. But then it kind of comes down to what do we do with it all, right? And how can we become better and more expert at these sorts of things? It's not unusual for the person in a financial capacity to become what we call essentially the product champion, or the person in the organization most knowledgeable, not about the technology actually of a system, but more they become the person most knowledgeable about how the system can work for the company. They'll understand both the process and the functions of the ERP or the accounting system or whatever it might be, but they're also going to understand the application of that and the configuration of that and how it actually helps their business run. Because things may come in a certain way where they become essentially out of the box functionally capable, but then they have to mold that as companies and also as product integrators to make the company's use of those systems to be effective. That's the key that a champion needs to understand. Champion says, all right, I'm the product champion and person most knowledgeable, but I need to really understand how this thing works for us. And when people come to me with questions like, how come we're doing it this way? Or can you train me better on this? Or I don't understand how to actually run a report on that. The product champion, if you will, that's a word we use in the industry, is somebody who you really want to look to for that sort of a role. Thing is, though, it really varies by business. So as business size changes, that champion can take on different titles. So for example, in a really big business, multinational, multi-location, it's not unusual to have something called a business analyst performing that role. So if you're in that role, and maybe some of you are, that's an absolutely normal situation to be in, where it's not just what do you know about the software in general, but also why is it used and how is it used for our organization, and what can I get out of it to make it meaningful for the users. That's really important. If you're in a smaller business or a moderate-sized business, you're either going to be typically the CFO or the controller. Most of those companies don't engage or retain a business analyst on staff, and typically it's somebody wearing multiple hats, doing other things, financially oriented, and oh, by the way, you become the product champion also. So kind of normal, and it happens in a way where really every company kind of needs somebody, because you don't want to always rely on calling the vendor every time you have a question that really is something that somebody should know from inside the organization. Kind of lends itself to next asking, okay, that's great, but if I'm that person, how do I stay on top of this thing? How do I make sure that I'm comfortable enough that my skills are going to be able to keep us going on this software to some degree? I may need the vendor here and there, but what can I do to keep myself, going? So we call this sharpening the saw, of course, but really what that means is keep yourself aware. Learn what's going on in your business, okay? Learn what's going on in the software application, and here's a couple examples of how you can do that. First off, when you go through the first training, before it ever went live, before you've even turned on all the switches in the system for real-time processing of whatever you're processing, don't skimp on training, okay? We see so many failures in industry when we're out consulting with people when they say, gosh, we really don't like our software, or gosh, we just don't feel very good about how we're processing our information. Sometimes it comes down to either no one learned how to use the system well enough, or someone did 10 years ago, but nobody was learning it as more current and with all kinds of new training materials. It really depends, but training is really key, especially before it even gets put in, as well as on an ongoing basis to stay trained and to keep your users trained. So again, if you're that product champion, keep your saw sharpened on the things that matter most to what you need to know, but also make sure everybody has training on the pieces that help make that system effective for the organization. Also, there's product continuing education. Most apps out there these days provide some level of user conference and other sorts of tools and training manuals online and videos and all kinds of things to keep you current on the product. Products get upgraded along the way by the vendors. As these things change and happen, there's all kinds of ways to get educated. Usually you subscribe to a support plan and these things sort of happen by nature, but it's hard for everybody to take time out of their day to say, I think I'm just going to go watch a training video. But keep in mind, if you're the product champion, if you will, it's pretty important to have that behind you. Go to user conferences, by the way. There are user conferences that are often provided by the vendor, and just stay in touch. Keep yourself active with the vendor. Make sure whoever helped you implement your system knows that you're there and it's ready to go. There are times where in an organization, regardless of what application software mix you have, you find yourself saying, it's just not getting the job done. Even if everything was laid out right and things were configured appropriately for the company, maybe things have changed. Maybe your processes have changed. Maybe you've acquired a new business. Maybe you've got some new product lines that are going on. Lots of different reasons. Maybe there's other reasons where you kind of are all tired of a 25-year-old system. It happens, right? So what happens is people say it's time to move on and upgrade. Upgrading software is a very expensive, very time-consuming, and extremely risk-prone area. I spent a lot of my professional time in this area, and I can give a few thoughts right now about really, the process as a whole and some of the things that you may want to think about when you're thinking about an upgrade or a replacement. Let's start with the first. The first is really step back and figure out what we're trying to deal with here. What's the outcome? Okay, what are we trying to accomplish in terms of we've got to put some new software in the company? Well, for a lot of reasons, maybe so, but what do we really want to see when it's all done? And in theory, at the beginning of this process, no matter who's trying to initiate it, if you can't define what the outcomes should be, not necessarily down to how we're going to process a new transaction, but the fact that by putting in a new application and spending the time and energy, we should have better information about productivity, for example, or we'll be able to ship sooner because we're going to have more information, or we're going to be able a whole lot better assigning our staff to professional service engagements. Whatever that might be, let's come up with those, put them out there, and kind of think through, all right, no matter what we do along the way of this whole upgrade process, let's not forget what's out there. Okay, it's really key. It's almost like looking across the pond, and you got to cross this thing, and it's a little bit difficult. You're gonna have to swim and move around and everything else. You want to get over there. The outcomes are key, and don't forget where you're going. Okay, that's the key. And I think a lot of companies forget about that, and they just kind of think, well, we've got to upgrade, let's just get it done, and they all get lost and mired in the detail. Okay, keep in mind that detail is important, but you always have to think about where you're going. We see that failure occurs because people don't commit, as companies anyway, the resources, things like management time, management commitment, management buy-in, management leadership, as well as money resources and time resources. It's really hard for companies to kind of stay consistently supportive from the top down, tone at the top, all the way down to everybody on the project, committed and ready and able to make this thing happen, because people still have to do their day jobs and business still goes on. So just make sure that before you tackle this thing, you guys are really ready to take on the commitment of resources that we just described. Finally, when you go into the process of upgrades, okay, it's a very clear process. Okay, what we find is people sometimes run into trouble when they don't do what really is the important first step. And that first step is, let's define what our requirements are. Let's do an analysis. Let's figure out what it is that our business needs to accomplish, process by process, department by department, that will be affected by that kind of software. So if we're looking at new accounting or ERP software, we're going to look at a lot of things. Order to cash, those sorts of things. How do we buy things? How are people processing purchase orders? How are we dealing with things in accounts payable? What are these departments doing? Let's figure out what they're doing and then determine, essentially from a functional perspective, what is it the accounting software, ERP software, or whatever it might be, what does it need to provide for us, okay, in these areas? And really, when do we need to do it? How important is it versus something else? These are all requirements analyses, processes that are absolutely key. And unfortunately, most companies start the process of talking to vendors and they call, hey, we need some software, and then there's no requirements analysis to give them. So step back, require yourself, make your organization go through the process of a requirements analysis. After that, it's almost much more logical, much more simple, because you, again, always know where you're shooting. The requirements are consistent with the across the pond concept I shared earlier. You're going to want to go right into essentially figuring out which vendors are the appropriate vendors. Okay, you're going to move from there into more of a demonstration stage, and you're going to let the vendors show you a little bit more about how your business would apply to the functions in their software and vice versa. Ultimately, you evaluate them against each other. You look at, essentially function, and certainly the integrator, the person doing the work for you, is important in this evaluation. And then we go through a selection of which one of all these things you're going to pick. And then you get into what's called readiness. Readiness is important. It's another one of those steps people forget about. And really what we see is if readiness is defined as basically making sure the organization's ready before they start implementing this software, it involves making sure people understand what's the impact on their jobs going to be. How does the system going to change everything? What are the processes that are going to be uniquely different or removed, okay, when we put in this new application? This whole readiness, it's also sometimes called change management, is very, very important, and unfortunately not always done, except for in very large companies. Our argument would be, keep in mind that it's something you can do even if you're not in a real large organization, and it comes back and pays dividends later on. Finally, once you've gone through readiness, you essentially go through a kickoff process with the vendor, and then you're off to the races. But again, don't forget, measure across the pond where you're going.